Hello, and welcome to the Masters of Applied Leadership in Positive Education, or MALPE. I am Dr. Vicente Reyes, and I'm here to accompany you in your journey through Unit 503, Realizing Positive Education Environments. For this particular research section, we will tackle one specific query. How do I make an impact to my system? We believe that in order to address that question, we need to sharpen our research skills of exploration. In order to do that, we will expose you through the rudiments of various research approaches that are essential in order for you to undertake an exploration of what is out there in the field of positive leadership education. I invite you to critically engage with this presentation as you continue your learning journey under the MALP program. Thank you. By the end of this session, you should be able to define quantitative and qualitative research, explain what has influenced the development of quantitative research and qualitative research, identify differences and similarities between quantitative and qualitative research, identify the types of research designs used as procedures in quantitative, qualitative of combined mixed research, and identify factors useful for deciding whether to use a quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods approach in a study. Let's take a look at the definitions of quantitative and qualitative research. Quantitative research is defined as a type of educational research in which the researcher decides what to study, asks specific, narrow questions, collects quantifiable data from participants, analyzes these numbers using statistics, and conducts the inquiry in an unbiased, objective manner. Qualitative research is defined as a type of educational research in which the researcher relies on the views of participants, asks broad general questions, collects data, consisting largely of words or text from participants, describes and analyzes these words for themes, and conducts the inquiry in a subjective, biased manner. For this particular research session within Unit 503, the main question that we're going to be using as a springboard for our examples would be the following. What are the factors that determine student achievement? The development of quantitative research can best be seen by taking a look at historical trends. When we take a look at the history of quantitative research, we can detect two big movements that have determined it. First would be the emergence of statistical procedures, and the other one would be proliferation of test and measurement practices. When we take a look at statistical procedures, we can identify three movements that have emerged. One would be correlational procedures. The other one would be the comparison of groups. And the third one would be cause and effect relationships. These three processes are very much linked to the strengthening of techniques related to statistical procedures. Quantitative research has also developed through test and measurement practices. And if we take a look at that particular phenomenon, we can actually identify three waves that determine these practices. In the late 19th century, there was a proliferation of tests of mental abilities. This was followed later on, much later on, by a movement towards measuring achievement. And the most recent phenomenon would be predicting achievement from standardized measurements. Earlier, I gave you the question, what are the factors that determine student achievement, as an example that we will be working on as we explore quantitative and qualitative research. If we take a look at statistical procedures, tests that determine school type and its relationship with student achievement is an example of a correlation procedure, which is one way of answering that question that we have identified. If we take a look at comparison of groups, an example of this would be, again, looking at student achievement differences between different types of races. If we take a look at cause and effect relationships, an example of this would be teacher factors being the cause determining student achievement, in this particular example taking the position of effects. There are 5 other epochs that we have to consider when we take a look at historical trends in quantitative research designs. The first would be the emergence of educational surveys that happened in the late 19th century, followed by the emergence of simple experiments, and this occurred in the early 20th century. Multiple groups and tests was a trend that followed later, and this happened in the middle of the 20th century. This was followed by longitudinal designs, and in the 60s, authoritative books on research design emerged. Some of this would be the works of Campbell and Stanley and Kurlinger. If we carefully look at the historical trends and characteristics of quantitative research, we will basically be able to identify 3 different types of emphases. The first emphasis is on collecting and analyzing information in the form of numbers. A specific example of this would be the emergence of the idea referred to as the intelligence quotient, or IQ. The next emphasis is on collecting scores that measure distinct attributes of individuals and organizations. In contemporary Australia, an example of this would be the NAPLAN scores in education. The third emphasis is on the procedures of comparing groups or relating factors about individuals or groups in experiments, correlational studies, and surveys. Using NAPLAN scores, we could actually compare NAPLAN scores by controlling for, say, gender, type of race, or even socioeconomic standing. We now move on to the development of qualitative research. In understanding qualitative research, we will be looking at the emergence of 3 different themes, different but very much interrelated. The first theme would be philosophical ideas. These ideas come precisely as a rebuttal to quantitative research, the very positivist approach that determines quantitative research. The next theme that follows in the development of qualitative research would be procedural developments. And the final theme can be described as advocacy practices. Let's continue discussing the first major theme in qualitative research, which refers to philosophical ideas. We can identify two broad philosophical streams that have emerged and that have greatly influenced the emergence of qualitative research. One is the idea of naturalistic inquiry or constructivism. This particular philosophical idea hinges on the belief that it is important to consider the participant's point of view. If you remember, in quantitative research, we collect numbers that describe participants or individuals. And in these efforts, there's really no consideration about the point of view of these participants. However, in qualitative research, naturalistic inquiry or constructivism says that it is important to consider the participants' points of view. The other would be to describe participants' views within a particular setting or context. The other philosophical idea that has shaped qualitative research will be looking at alternative perspectives to traditional research, which I mentioned earlier, is really very positivistic. In other words, everything can be predicted based on evidence that is measurable. Looking back at the main example that I have identified for our research section, the question, what are the factors that determine student achievement? I provided you with examples of how this can be approached from a quantitative perspective. These can also be approached from a qualitative perspective. An example of this would be the following questions. What does student achievement mean to different types of students? Here, the participants' points of views are taken into careful consideration. Another example would be, how important is student achievement to different types of students? Instead of looking at student achievement as something that is fixed to characteristics of different individuals, this second question takes a look at the level of importance that different types of students attach to the idea of student achievement. Procedural developments in the history of qualitative research can be broken down into three different approaches. The first one could be described as a focus towards looking at a central phenomenon rather than at research questions or hypotheses. Research questions or hypotheses, as you may already know, is the central areas that quantitative research focus on. But for qualitative research, there was a shift towards looking at the notion of what is a central phenomenon. The other procedural development can be described as a move towards methods that were rich in undertaking observations and interviews. In terms of types of research designs that are more typical of qualitative research, what has emerged will be case studies, grounded theory, and narrative inquiries. Going back to the main example that we are looking at for this particular research section, typified by the question, what are the factors that determine student achievement? We can tweak this particular question so that we focus on using observations and interviews towards, for example, exploring a central phenomenon. The question, what issues and challenges do school actors face in dealing with student achievement, can be pursued by looking at observations and interviews, and in so doing gain a better perspective on the central phenomenon referred to in this particular question as student achievement. We could also design studies that are more grounded theory in nature, which essentially means developing an inductive way of looking at theory development. The question, how do different actors in school define student achievement is an example of this, where what happens would be extracting how different respondents perceive student achievement and coming up with a ground going up description of what emerging theory is. The third and final trend that describes qualitative research would be the preponderance of advocacy practices. We could actually define this by looking at 4 points. First, the qualitative researcher is seen as a person or an individual who is not an objective and politically neutral observer. So, this is an advocacy that qualitative research pursues, that researchers are not objective, neither are they politically neutral. The second point is that the qualitative researcher is seen as an observer of the human condition. Third point is that the meaning of research is plural, political, and open. This, of course, is very different from what quantitative research aspires to achieve. That would be irrefutable and empirically based theories or findings represented by um, tests of hypothesis, for example. Final point in advocacy practices in qualitative research would be that the research project itself is collaborative and participatory. If we take a look at the key question that we have identified for this particular research section, what are the factors that determine student achievement? We could actually tweak this such that we are able to highlight the advocacy practices nature that is found in qualitative research. The question, what is the impact of the demands of student achievement on teaching practice, provides an opportunity for a plural, open, and most probably a political meaning of research in exploring and uncovering how student achievement is defined. The question, how does school management perceive the impact of the demands of student achievement, can also be a representative of how the advocacy practice of collaborative and participatory features of qualitative research are highlighted. The graphic in this particular slide provides a picture of the differences in the characteristics of quantitative and qualitative research in the process of research. If we take a look at the main image, which is in the middle, we will see the 6 steps in the research process, starting from the identification of a problem, review of the literature, the specification of a purpose, collecting data, the analysis and interpreting of data, and reporting and evaluating data. On the left-hand side of your screen, you will see an enumeration of the quantitative characteristics which define each step in the research process. On the right-hand side, you will see qualitative characteristics that define each step in the research process. In this graphic, you will see similarities and, more importantly, differences when one takes a look at characteristics of quantitative and qualitative research. We need to take note that there are ways in which quantitative and qualitative research are similar. There are 3 ways that the similarities occur. First, they both follow the steps in the process of research. Both quantitative and qualitative research follow the 6 steps of the research process. Secondly, the format for reporting The research problem is the same. And finally, both approaches have data collection steps. Relating research designs to quantitative and qualitative research and the steps in the research process. In this particular graphic, we see three columns. The first one represent the steps in the research process from the identification of a problem all the way to reporting and evaluation. The second column describes the two approaches, and the third column represents research designs. As can be seen in the graphic, the research designs actually emerge when there is already a discussion of data collection, analysis and interpretation of data, and reporting and evaluation. Essentially, the three steps in the research process, beginning from collecting data and ending in reporting and evaluation, is where one can distinguish and determine the research designs. If you take a look at collecting data, analysis and interpretation, reporting and evaluation from a purely quantitative viewpoint, some research designs that can emerge would be the experimental design, the correlational research design, and the survey research design. If we take a look at the purely qualitative perspective, what we would see would be the ethnographic research design, grounded theory research design, and narrative inquiry research designs. Of course, there are also data collection, analysis and interpretation, and reporting and evaluation that use both quantitative and qualitative approaches. In these cases, what we see would be mixed methods research designs and action research. In a later slide, I will be explaining in greater detail what mixed methods research designs actually mean. What are the designs and uses of quantitative research? In an earlier slide, I spoke about three different quantitative research designs. One would be experimental research, the other one would be correlational research, and the third one would be survey research. Looking at this graphic, we could actually see that these three research designs could further be categorized into two. One category would be intervention research, where we see experimental research falling well within that particular category, and the other one would be non-intervention research. And in this second category, we find correlational research and survey research. Taking note of the main question that we are exploring in this research section of Unit 503, determining factors related to student achievement, and looking at an experimental research defined as explaining whether an intervention influences an outcome for one group as opposed to another group. The theme, teacher factors determine student achievement, is an example of how intervention research under the design of experimental research can be accomplished. If we take a look at correlational research, defined as associating or relating variables in a predictable pattern for one group of individuals, the theme, school type, and student achievement is an example of correlational research. If we look at survey research, defined as describing trends for the population of the people or the sample under the study, the theme student achievement differences between races is an example of how non intervention research in the form of a survey research project can be pursued. On the other hand, qualitative designs and their uses can also be better understood by taking a look at a few examples. Earlier, I mentioned that research designs that fall under the qualitative realm could be in the form of an ethnographic research, a grounded theory research, or a narrative inquiry type of research. Ethnographic research explores the shared culture of a group. An example of this, again using the main theme of student achievement, could be student achievement's impact on teachers' practices. Teachers' practices would be seen here as a culture of the shared group of teachers. Grounded theory research explores common experiences of individuals in order to develop a theory. An example of this could be looking or exploring student achievement and the meaning that it gives or provides as students make sense of their educational experiences. Narrative research or narrative inquiry explores individual stories to describe the lives of people. An example of this would be looking at school actors, particularly their definition of what student achievement is. Here, the definition of school actors would be based on stories that they share as they live through their experiences in school. In an earlier slide, I also mentioned about combining quantitative and qualitative research. And in this particular graphic, we will be looking at the uses of these combined designs. I gave two examples. One would be mixed methods research, and the other one was action research. Mixed methods research combines quantitative and qualitative data to understand and explain a research problem better. An example of this would be, again, looking at the main question that we're exploring in this particular research section, student achievement and impact on teachers' practices. The quantitative component of this project could be a survey of teachers' responses to the question of impact of student achievement. The qualitative component can take the form of focus group discussions of selected teachers as they explain what they perceive is the impact of student achievement on what they do. This would be an example of a mixed methods research, combining quantitative and qualitative research. Action research uses quantitative and qualitative data for individuals to study problems that they face in their settings. Action research, as opposed to mixed methods, is more focused on problem solving. An example of action research would be, again, looking at the same theme, the same question, student achievement and impact on teachers' practices. What could be done would be what could be described as communities of practice initiative. This one could be measured, a quick survey on the usefulness of notion of a community's practice can be undertaken. And this survey will be the quantitative component. Similarly, the communities of practice, this concept could also be understood better by undertaking interviews with selected teachers. Again, the purpose of action research would be to try to solve a problem. In this example, the existence of a community of practice or the need to establish a practice is seen as the problem that needs to be solved. We could imagine, or we can imagine that in this particular school setting, they are thinking of whether or not it would be worthwhile to continue a pilot community of practice project that has recently been undertaken in the school. When do you use quantitative or qualitative approaches? There are three items that you may consider in order to decide whether to use a quantitative or qualitative approach. First, match the approach to the problem. It sounds almost very commonsensical, but it is a very important idea that researchers need to be able to address. If the problem that they're looking at refers to quantifiable phenomena, for example, scores, then it may be wise to use a quantitative approach. If what they wish to explore would be something that is very difficult to quantify, such as culture, practices, then perhaps a qualitative approach may be more appropriate. Secondly, it would be also good to fit the approach to your audience. This is particularly true for researchers who are implementing grants. They have received funding in order to pursue grants, and usually these grants come with very precise instructions whether the research should be more of a quantitative or a qualitative nature. So remembering who the audience is absolutely vital, and is also very important in the eventual decision of what approach to use. The final criterion that one can consider would be to relate the approach, either quantitative or qualitative, to the researcher's experience. If the researcher is more attuned or proficient in undertaking quantitative research, then it may well be the most practical thing to adopt. For those who are familiar with the qualitative approach, again, building on one's strengths, this could be the approach that researchers may intend to pursue. It would now be timely to talk about mixed methods. In mixed methods, there are actually three types of designs, three groups of mixed methods designs. The first one would be referred to as a triangulation designs. In triangulation designs, the researcher gives priority to both quantitative, represented as uppercase QUAN, and qualitative, uppercase QUAL data. Researchers also collect both quantitative and qualitative data concurrently, and the researcher compares the results from the quantitative and qualitative analysis to determine if the two databases yield similar or dissimilar results. The important component here to take note of is that in triangulation mixed methods design, application of the quantitative and qualitative components are done concurrently. The other category of mixed methods would be explanatory design. In this particular design, the researcher places priority on quantitative, uppercase QUAN data collection and analysis. The researcher collects quantitative data first in the sequence. This would provide researchers a broad picture of the research problem that is being explored or being studied. And then the researcher uses the qualitative data to explain the results of the quantitative data. This essentially is the explanatory mixed methods design. The third category of mixed methods is referred to as exploratory design. Research emphasizes qualitative, uppercase QUAL data, rather than quantitative, lowercase QUAN data. The researcher has a sequence of data collection that involves collecting qualitative data first, followed by quantitative data. Finally, the researcher plans on the quantitative data to build on or explain the initial findings derived. The graphic in this slide provides us a snapshot of the three categories of mixed methods designs. The first one, triangulation mixed methods, sees the concurrent application of quantitative and qualitative approaches. In the notation that is used, we can observe that quan, QUAN, is written in uppercase, and the same is written for qual, uppercase QUAL. So data and results for quantitative and qualitative data are implemented concurrently, and interpretations also implemented concurrently. Second one, explanatory mixed methods design, sees the prioritization of quan. That's why it is written in uppercase QUAN, prioritization in data collection and the generation of initial results. And then qual, lowercase QAL, follows in order to explain what had been derived in the quantitative aspect of this mixed methods. The final category is what we refer to as exploratory mixed methods design. Here the priority would be on qualitative research, uppercase QUAL, data gathering and initial results. And then what happens is that the these findings from qualitative research would then be used to eliminate the research problem being explored, and thus what will be employed will be a quantitative approach, and the data and the results analysis follows from the initial qualitative approach. This would be exploratory mixed methods design. At this point of this research section under Unit 503, I invite you to work in pairs or with your group and use the source article indicated below. The article is from Scott, Coates, and Anderson. Title is Learning Leaders in Times of Change in Academic Leadership Capabilities for Australian Higher Education. And in reading this article, I invite your group to tackle the following questions. What research design or designs were employed for the study on Australian leadership? Secondly, how did these research designs contribute to your appreciation and understanding of issues related to leadership in Australian education. As you end this particular research section of Unit 503, I invite you to undertake personal reflection in relation to my proposed action research project. Comment on the research perspectives offered by quantitative and qualitative research, and focus on the following. Which research approach are you more comfortable with? Quantitative, qualitative, both? Why? What do you think are the limitations, strengths of either research approach? Give specific examples. In your opinion, which one do you think is more useful? Please state your reasons.